So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is the Techlandia Summit Economic Resilience panel. We're going to talk about public-private partnerships. We've actually got 2 hours, so we'll probably blur the line between this session and the breakout. So Ruthie, if you could flick to the next slide, that would be great. So Ruthie's going to be helping me today. I'm Wilf Pinfold, CEO of Urban Systems and also president of a nonprofit called Open Commons. And Ruthie Dietzler, is that the right way to say it, Ruthie?
Yep.
Ruthie will be helping today from the TAO side. And if you have, please, as we go through, you'll see we ask you to stay muted, but please remember that that Ruthie is, Ruthie and Skip, I think, are both on, and you can send them messages if you want to get them to the organizers. So that would be great. So go to the next slide. I think you should all be muted. Please stay that way unless unmuted by Ruthie. It'll allow us to coordinate things better. If you do want to get attention, I think the raise hands is there. I believe it's there. If you open up the participants activity, I think you'll see an option under more for raise hands. So please do that. Please disable your camera so as we have bandwidth, unless you're presenting or speaking. Say you can send a note to TAO admin, which I think goes to Ruthie or Skip, or raise your hand to get attention. And we will try and answer nonverbal participant questions if they need more than just to be relayed to the panelists. We will then Ruthie will open up your audio and you can ask directly. Ruthie, anything else that I should ask for there?
I was just going to say, I mean, this is a small enough group that if there's, if there's an interesting conversation and folks, if you want to just call on folks to chime in, Wolf, that's totally fine. They don't need to go through me to be unmuted. So
Great.
Everyone does have the capability to unmute themselves and can use that as they wish.
Great, that sounds good. And I think I know a whole lot of the people on here, so I'll know who to call at. So we are recording, and the content from the recording will be posted on YouTube, hopefully within 24 hours, which would be great. Did you want to say anything more about the Twitter and other feeds, Ruthie?
Just if folks have interesting takeaways from the conversation or quotes that they want to share, you can tag us at Tech Oregon across all social media platforms, and we're always happy to get those shout outs, and we'll share your content too. So feel free to shout out to Tech Oregon.
Great. And a shout out to all our sponsors and investors that are listed here. You can add anything more to that, Ruthie, if you want to call anybody out.
Nope, I think that's good. Thanks to everyone who's invested in the Techlandia Summit.
Click to the next one. So let me start by introducing the panel. We have, as I say, it's broken into 2 pieces. There's a panel session and then a breakout session. And I think we'll sort of roll into the breakout session through the questions. So once we get some dialogue going, we'll probably roll straight over. So the panelists who will start off, and I'll ask each of them to just give us a sort of 10-minute introduction. But let me start by introducing them. So Lisa Abuaf, who is development manager at Prosper Portland. Patrick Doherty, who's co-founder of Long Haul Capital and also the co-author of New Grand Strategy. Great book. You should take a look at it if you find this discussion interesting. And then Jay Nath, who is co-executive director of City Innovate. And I'll ask each of them to talk for 10 minutes, but if you just show the last slide, I think then we'll at least be prepped for sort of rolling into questions here. I asked 3 folks to help me with this. I don't think that John Haines has joined us yet, but he will join us during the discussion here. He's come up a lot because of the work he's done on Community Investment Trust as part of this, and I might ask him to give a bit of an overview once he's joined us a little later on. Ian Magazine, who is co-chair of the Utility Supercluster. There'll be several folks on the call from our NIST activities, National Institute of Standards and Technology. Skip and I are both co-chairs of the Transportation Supercluster, and Ian is a co-chair of the Utility Supercluster, and then Limor Schafman, who is the co-chair of the Building Supercluster. We're all working on various aspects of smart city, and the issue about public-private partnerships has come up across all of our activities. So I've asked them to join me and make sure that we delve into all aspects of where public-private partnerships will play a role here. So let me just go back and introduce Lisa again. So Lisa, if you don't mind, if you'd introduce yourself and talk a little bit about how you see public-private partnerships playing a role in what you do at Prosper, and anything else you think is relevant to the discussion. So Lisa, let me hand it over to you.
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Lisa Abuaf. I am with Prosper Portland. And so some folks may be familiar with Prosper Portland. Some folks, it may be new. Prosper Portland is the economic development and redevelopment agency for the city of Portland. We have about a 50-60 year history, actually, in Portland. We are the designated urban renewal agency for Portland, and I'll touch a little bit on that as we kind of move into what we do, public-private partnerships, and how increasingly equity and consideration of who benefits is at the heart of what we do as an agency. So as the economic development entity on behalf of the city, we actually offer both small business support as well as traded sector support, and that's done through our economic development team. And then on the development side, we have a pretty long-standing history in Portland of being the lead agency of entering into place-based and real estate and infrastructure development-based public-private partnerships. So that's resulted in a lot of the redevelopment of Portland's central city areas. And we have a number of tools of how we do that. So we can do that through land acquisitions and dispositions. We also have a number of financial tools. So we're able to offer grants, we're able to offer loans, and it primarily uses a financial tool called tax increment financing as our financial base for that. Just a little bit of kind of examples of projects that Prosper Portland has been involved with. If you are familiar with the Pearl District or South Waterfront, in Portland's downtown, those have been implemented through public-private partnerships where either we had land control or the private sector did. And then we coordinate across all of our city bureaus. So our utility partners, streets, parks, affordable housing, et cetera, to implement redevelopment at a district scale. And then we've also done individual projects that are much more community-based, things like the Mercado or the Asian Health Services Center out in East Portland, and I can talk a little bit about those as well, where we similarly used our land-based tools as well as our financial tools to implement public-private partnerships. Everything we touch as an agency is a public-private partnership, so we are not intended to do the work on behalf of the private sector, but in fact to engage into partnerships with the private sector to both incent and help drive change. And probably the thing that I will close out with, particularly given the lens of today's discussion and just the lens and awareness of what is happening across kind of the US, but particularly in our urban communities, is probably about 5 to 7 years ago, the agency made a pretty significant commitment to equity, and social and racial equity as the foundation for our investments and our projects and initiatives. And so we have undertaken that through adjustments to our financial products, really thinking about who's involved in public-private partnerships, all the way from land acquisition to disposition to who's constructing projects, to who's investing in those projects. And maybe that's something we can touch a little bit on today. and really being intentional about how our Black, Indigenous, and people of color owned businesses and individuals have access to those opportunities, and how we as a public sector show up in a way that can help create thought leadership within the private sector. And then the other major transition that the agency has done is much more community-based development. So we have, there are two examples of that I'll just share. We have relationship managers in all of the communities where we have resources to invest. We have lead staff who are kind of our primary points of contact, who work very closely with either existing, or we actually often will stand up kind of new nonprofit partners. And that's on both the business side as well as the residential side. And the second example I would have is we actually have an initiative called the Neighborhood Prosperity Network Initiative, where there are communities that did not have kind of standing business organizations. So either kind of standing resources for the community to access small business assistance or workforce assistance. And we supported over the past 5 to 7 years, again, a network of neighborhood prosperity network areas that is a community-based approach to economic development. So I think that kind of sets up for our conversation, hopefully looking forward to the conversation today to both share what we're doing in Portland and hear what's happening nationally, as well as some thought partnership on the private side as to where there's additional changes or pivots that we as the public can make to further those priorities.
Thanks, Lisa. That was excellent, and thanks for the examples. I think it really helps to get some practical examples on the table to talk about. So let's move on, and I'll ask Patrick if you wouldn't mind to do the same, to give a little bit on your background, and talk a little bit about the work that you're doing with private equity to sort of advance the state of our critical infrastructure and particularly your efforts around sustainable infrastructure.
Take myself off mute. Thank you, Wilf. It's a pleasure to be here. And first, Limor, could you give me ability to share my screen? I just want to throw some slides up so people can see.
So you're a co-host now, so you should be able to.
Thank you. I'm going to stop your sharing and
we can see that. That's good.
Can you see that now?
Yeah, we can see that. Thanks.
Great. So I'm Patrick Doherty. I live in the other land, Cleveland, not Portland. So I appreciate the Techlandia moniker. And I'm there now. So it's great to be with you all. I want to bridge from the work we did on the book, and then the company that we formed as a result of it, and then talk about what we're doing in Portland with Wilf and Lisa. So basically, in 2016, we wrote a book that came out of some research and policy work we're doing in Washington around how a large-scale transition to sustainable macroeconomy might be possible using an old concept called grand strategy. Came out of some work that originated in the Pentagon. And the conclusion we came to was that there is a new grand strategy that can be developed. You're seeing some of those ideas start to bubble up in this concept of the Green New Deal, but that we didn't have any real confidence that a Green New Deal type approach would have the votes in Congress to result in the level of spending required for that type of ambitious effort. And so we understood that we can't wait for Washington. We need to figure out some private approaches to getting that work done. And so we launched Long Haul Capital Group to go after what we saw were three key approaches that could really use some of the long-term low-rate capital that is sitting underutilized in the in capital markets right now, where we have trillions, tens of trillions of dollars sitting in zero or negative returning assets, and put them into the process of solving for our shared challenges around sustainability and inclusion. So we set out with Long Haul Capital Group to focus on a small number of core hypotheses that would be self-reinforcing, that if we can move long-term low-rate capital into them, we can begin to start to rebuild our communities with sustainability and inclusion as a core principle, and not wait on Washington. And so that meant doing things that normally would have been done by governments, say federal government in the past, or through centralized approaches in the 50s and 60s, doing it through a more decentralized public-private partnership kind of way. And so we've identified these three around district infrastructure, looking at stacks of utilities that can be dropped into transit-oriented developments to create and to lower the cost fundamentally of those transit-oriented places and the lifestyles inside there. Intercity rail to create and connect more transit-oriented places, and then housing finance so that the cost of financing your new sustainable, regenerative, inclusive American dream is lower, and moves away from the incentives that Fannie and Freddie still carry that force home buyers to drive until they qualify. So that was our concept going in, and to do that, we formed some partnerships and joint ventures. The reason I'm here is because of the work we're doing around infra centers and with urban systems in the OMSI district, the OMSI redevelopment plan, the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry there in Portland, where we're testing out this idea of district systems, and how can we start to create a package of district systems that can start to replicate across transit networks, so that we can create resilient, efficient, and kind of swappable nodes, so that we can rapidly accelerate into a sustainable and inclusive future. And to do that, we're coming up with a lot of the concepts around that we're supposed to be talking about today, around public-private partnerships. And so to understand what we're doing in Portland, this is the site. It's on the Willamette River. It's in the central city, but on the east side of the river. If you know Portland, the main city, and the Pearl District are on the west side. This is on the southern east side, and but it's got about 1/3 of a mile of river frontage, and it's right adjacent to the Tillicum crossing bridge, which is a transit bridge. So it's transit oriented by its location, but it's mostly surface parking currently. And so the plan for the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry is to transform that 11 buildable parcels, and but it needs to be an exemplar in terms of its sustainability, but also a place where that can be a place for the larger community. And so we're working with Urban Systems, with Prosper Portland, and with a bunch of other organizations to make that possible. We're now partnered with the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians to create something called the Center for Tribal Nations. The Center for Tribal Nations will be a building that will hopefully co-locate a number of different tribal offices, but also house this stack of district utilities called the Infra Center. To pull all that together, of course, we need a whole range of things. One, we need the planning dollars to be able to think at a different scale and to propose to the city a new approach to solving for these challenges, and together with Prosper Portland and the Bureau of Environmental Services, and as well as a number of tribal organizations, intertribal organizations, and OMSI, we've successfully or almost completed the process of receiving a large planning grant from Portland's Metro, the Metropolitan Council of Governments, that has some planning funding. So one element of the public-private partnership here is just providing planning dollars so that we can do something innovative that wouldn't necessarily pencil under business as usual. But then the district itself will probably have some type of local improvement district or TIF funds to help pay for some of the aspects, some of the elements in the district. We're intending that the infra center itself not necessarily need any TIF financing, and that's what Lisa had mentioned, the tax incremental financing approach to value capture, but other aspects of the district may very well do that. But ultimately, to do something innovative, we need to partner fundamentally with the city and its various components to get there. And so we're working with the Bureau of Environmental Services to make sure that the district wastewater system can operate, right, and meet the city's interests around health and safety. We're going to be doing the same thing with Portland Bureau of Transportation, with the utility, PGE, but it's fundamentally working together to create something new. And that innovation, until something is proven, you need to bring folks in early on as stakeholders so that everybody understands the intention and what's going into the sausage as it's being made. So perhaps I'll stop there and see if I hit my marks with Wilf and turn it back over.
Right on the money. Thank you very much, Patrick. That's excellent. I got loads of questions, but let's keep going and get Jay on the table too, if you wouldn't mind, Jay. Just give us an overview of who you are and your role and how that plays into potential public-private partnerships.
Absolutely. Thanks, Wilfred. And thank you to everybody for being here and also for inviting me. Thank you, Skip. Thank you, Wilfred. And glad to be joining Lisa and Patrick on this virtual panel. I'm currently the co-executive director at City Innovate, and our work is working with cities, regions, and state governments on public-private partnerships, primarily with early stage companies, startups, as well as with researchers. And my work in this area actually started in my prior role when I was Chief Innovation Officer for the Mayor of San Francisco. I was in that role for a number of years, 6 years, and a lot of our work was around sort of breaking down the barriers between City Hall and our community. Our first sort of foray was around data, open data. We were one of the first cities to really see data and unlock data as a new medium for collaboration and new way of citizen engagement, if you will. And we saw a lot of success with that and grew out our program. We now have data office and a chief data officer and passed legislation around that. And from there, that really sort of catalyzed my thinking about the opportunity to work more closely with our community, and specifically our business community and research community. And one of the things that we saw is that, you know, and it's self-evident when you go into government offices, there's a huge innovation gap between City Hall and governor's offices and what we use in our everyday lives. And so we asked ourselves, you know, how do we actually address that gap? What are the barriers to actually inviting all of the amazing talent that we have in our backyard, in our state and in our country, to help us modernize our digital infrastructure? And through that sort of conversation, we identified 3 barriers. One is that innovators really don't understand the needs and challenges of government. Second, they don't know how to sort of work through all the bureaucratic barriers that governments have put up. And third, they don't understand the culture of government. And so we set about really to break down those barriers, and we created a program called Startup in Residence, and we launched in 2014. And we set off with a couple of different examples. The one that really inspired me was the airport in San Francisco, SFO, was looking for a more equitable way for people with visual impairments to navigate through the airport. And they were able to work with a startup that also worked with a local nonprofit and the airport on building out a solution collaboratively, co-developing a solution over the course of 3 to 4 months. And unfortunately, though, it didn't really end in immediate success. It took 2 years for the airport to actually issue an RFP. May have been more than 2 years. They did get an award, I think, as a sub, but as you can imagine, 2+ years for a young company is a bit too long for them to be able to sort of navigate through that process. But from that, we saw that there was a real need to tackle procurement. So we've been focused on innovating procurement and really focusing on something called challenge-based procurement. And that has yielded so many benefits for the governments and cities that we've worked with. On the economic sort of resilience and development side, we've seen so many cities and regions and states be able to tap into their local startup community to drive impact and to invest in them. So they're really getting the benefit of modernizing their government digital infrastructure, as well as seeing these companies grow and hire people. These companies that have participated and have gotten contracts have gone on to fundraise over $500 million. There's been 4 acquisitions. They've created thousands of jobs, and we've been really fortunate to have received federal funding twice from the Department of Commerce for the job creation aspects of really investing in local businesses to help bridge that gap. And it's been a great journey, and we're now taking this work and in passing legislation. The governor of California passed an executive order on his first day in office on a very esoteric and wonky topic of procurement, and it speaks volumes. There's a recognition, I think, from a growing number of leaders that we needed to change how we work with the business community, and procurement is a really critical linchpin and rethinking that. So a lot of our work in transformation has been working with governors and mayors on unlocking all of that innovation that they have in their communities, and we've seen just a lot of success. And it's not just small projects. We've been able to work with projects valued over $100 million, and taking multiple years, bringing it down to 90 days. And I'll talk a little bit more about what challenge-based procurement is. But a big part of what I've done in my career has been public-private partnerships, not only with startups, but also with businesses, established businesses like Google and other large companies through a program called Civic Bridge, where they donate their talent and time and embed themselves in government to solving specific issues and challenges. As an example, in San Francisco, we, like many communities, are suffering from a lack of housing, affordable housing, and a team from Google helped design and helped us build out a product, affordable housing portal, that's now being used regionally and is now being looked at in LA. And it's an open source project. And again, I think there's so much sort of value and power in working across sectors and cross-sector collaboration to solve these big challenges that we have. The last thing I'll mention, and then turn it back to you, Wilfred, is we just received a grant from the National Science Foundation on building a bridge between the research community and cities and state governments, so that they are able to really tap into that amazing talent they might have regionally or nationally, to help them with research topics and issues, whether they might be a result of COVID-19 or a response to COVID-19 or in broader areas. And I've seen this firsthand, how cities Here in San Francisco, we've got world-class institutions, whether it's Stanford or UC Berkeley, and we have no real partnership. There is no sort of institutional sort of structure in place. And that's not always the case. I know many cities and states have some good partnerships, but we're looking at standardizing that model and really unlocking that research talent into communities, not only for economic development, but solving basic challenges and issues and creating insight. So I wanted to sort of end there because I think it's, it goes to the fact that it's not just the business community, but we have other sectors of our society that that can benefit by working across those different lines. So Wilfred, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jay. That was excellent as well. Really, really good groundwork and lots of issues raised there. I'll encourage people to either raise your hands or put comments and questions in the chat, but I'm going to take my my opportunity here as a host to sort of frame the first question. And Patrick, you talked a little bit about you know, the shift, which I think was going on well before the current crises, the shift away from you know, projects that are largely funded by the government. I know federal government infrastructure typically was heavily funded by the federal side. A lot of the roads projects would be 90% funded, and the proposals that were being put forward by the Trump administration were closer to 10%, which would be a huge shift. And that was before we entered the current crisis. And I think that's accelerated things in a number of ways, but it's pretty clear that whether one thinks of it as post-COVID or just the new normal, which I think is probably becoming more the way we think about this as a new normal, there is likely to be a paucity of tax revenue, certainly at the city and state level, because of the shutdown. And in parallel to that, there is likely to be there's likely to be a need to revamp much of our civic infrastructure, whether it's moving roads more towards you know, personal transit, or you know, building more active transit ways, or you know, rethinking how we use office space. There's going to be a number of ways in which both the equity issues raised by the Black Lives Matter movement and the future of work issues raised by COVID are going to make us need to do that. So I think the importance of encouraging private equity, which I think seems to be much more plentiful in tax revenue, the ways to encourage that to happen. And you see that side of it, you see that private equity side of it. What do you think are the things that we could be doing to encourage private equity into those kinds of investment, and how do you see those opportunities? You know, what could we or should we be doing to take advantage of that availability of private equity at a time when we desperately need investment in infrastructure?
Sure. Lots of stuff in there. First, just to clarify on private equity, while some of the investors may end up being technically private equity, we're focused on bringing impact investor and institutional investor capital into these projects, not so much what is within the capital markets universe called private equity, the Blackstones and KKRs.
Gotcha.
But is private equity investments, so in the small p and small e. I think, you know, the important, I mean, there's three important things for any of this stuff to bring private investment, if you will, especially from impact and institutional investors into these places. There needs to be kind of de-risking, standardization, and aggregation. So the reason being the project size, for a lot of the projects that need to happen, the dollar value is below the dollar value at which one of these large institutional investors is able to write a check for. So our friends at BlackRock can't write a check for less than $225 million, right? So that's a big chunk of money for a lot of the projects that are happening at across the city, and so there needs to be that aggregation kind of component. There needs to be an aggregator that pulls projects together or creates a fund so that you can have a flow of, from whether it's from CalPERS or the Oregon state pension, whatever it is, whoever the investor is, that they can, there's some type of ability to flow their members, the pension holders' money into a known fund with known performance metrics, and that requires that other thing, standardization. So the projects themselves need to be standardized. The problem is we're in a moment of extreme innovation because we're throwing off the shackles of the old model of, as you were talking about, Wilf, the publicly funded infrastructure assumption. And so much of what needs to be built is I think, going to need to be more and more privately funded. The good news is, on the de-risking side, I think there is a really good role for the public sector, including the federal government. On transportation, they've for decades they've had a project, a facility called TIFIA, Transportation Infrastructure Finance something or other Act, and that facility, owned by the Federal Transportation Agency, Federal Transit Agency within the Federal Department of Transportation, allows for a low level of risk assumption. They basically can take the risk tranche of any particular transit investment and enable significant private dollars to come in behind it, basically de-risking the project. On the other side of the ledger, on the payback side, folks like Lisa can construct tax incremental financing to ensure that the bondholders or whatever the mechanism is that's paying off the financing can be paid back over time. And so I think that's another critical area it's going to need expansion as we move forward. But ultimately, the implication is that we're all going to have to pay something more like the actual cost of our infrastructure. And it's not going to be subsidized by the federal government. My hope is that federal subsidies shift from transportation sector where it's locked in some winners, cars, and we actually shift that over to healthcare and some other places where I think the federal government can be a better provider of insurance. And then their role in infrastructure can be more of risk manager. And then I think you're going to see a more level playing field in the transportation sector where every mode is going to have to carry its own weight. And then once you do that, then you're going to have to layer in this question about equity. How do we make sure that we've built in equity into that newly priced universe, at least in this scenario of transportation modes? My sense, having run a lot of the numbers, is in what I've seen in at least 30 top US metros across the country, is that walkable communities are more equitable because the portion of low and moderate income households' budget that goes to transportation is dramatically reduced. So you don't need to buy a car, you don't need to own and operate a car to get to your job, to get to schools, to get to shopping, when you can live a really inherently walkable lifestyle. And that, I think, is a really important pathway to driving equity. And it's also, the flip side is the reason why a car-dominated culture is fundamentally segregated.
Great. Lisa, can I drag you in at this point? I mean, I think this is a critical issue. Clearly, if we're asking a more direct link between payer and payee, if you like, then the benefits of equity that come from using a tax base to fund things are harder to achieve. And so how could we structure these kinds of public-private relationships that ensure that socially beneficial infrastructure gets built, not just financially beneficial infrastructure?
Sure.
You're on mute, Lisa.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things that I would just kind of, as we're framing the conversation for smaller panel breakouts, I'm going to touch on two key issues, and one is accessibility and one is accountability. So I think the important part, because I think for a long while, kind of the way that Portland talks about what Patrick just shared is we talk about it as a 20-minute lifestyle, which is that you have the ability to get to your work or to get to community services or provisions within a 20-minute area around your community. And what we have found is, while that is successful from an environmental perspective, there is not equitable access to everybody to those communities because the real estate profile of those communities drive up both housing costs and commercial business costs. So they're more expensive for businesses to lease a space. They're more expensive for housing. So I could go through, there's any number of policies kind of we have incrementally been putting in place from a land use and regulatory perspective to try to equalize that factor. But I think accessibility and who has access to those opportunities is really a key factor. And you can think about that in a lot of different ways. And again, and particularly given that Patrick touched a little bit on the who's investing, when we start, and we do mostly vertical development in partnership with our infrastructure bureaus that do the infrastructure development. But the way that we have started to parse it out is literally who has access to owning that asset, and operating that asset, who has access to investing in that asset, who has access to constructing that asset, and how does it tie back to two key items. And it's something we talked about in preparation. One is how do you make sure that it's capital that is both acknowledging that there's global capital, but how do you make sure that it's capital that's within the community? And I know kind of that will be part of today's conversation. And particular to Prosper's resources, we actually put a social and racial equity lens to what disadvantaged communities who have not had equitable access historically over hundreds of years in this country have access to those financial and wealth creation opportunities. So I think access, I think we need to think holistically about who has access. The second is around accountability, which is increasingly as an agency, and Jay talked a lot about data and the importance of data, is using data to both tell the narrative of who's had access and how we're performing as both a public and private sector. So increasingly, as we do equity-based work, the idea of results-based accountability is really key and critical. So both how are we reporting data, who has access to that data, what is that data telling us in terms of who's been impacted and who's benefited by those outcomes is really key and critical. And the other is there's kind of the software side of the data, which is how is the community engaged? And I know kind of community engagement may also be a theme, but how is the community engaged not only at the front end about what's being built, but also on the back end about what are the benefits or impacts that they're seeing as a community off of those investments or those improvements. So if I had to kind of set the framework for future discussions as part of the breakout groups, it's really thinking about accessibility and accountability.
You're muted, Wilf.
Thanks. Sorry. Jay, maybe I can pull you in a little bit at this point. I see you've been having a bit of a dialogue with Sushmita about it too, but I think as Amy talked about the sort of a stack here of different investors and who's investing and why. And I'm wondering whether some of the technology that we're working with at the moment would allow us to be more flexible about smaller investments from communities and combining that with investment from organizations like Prosper that have an economic development direction and and other tax kind of investments. If there are things on the horizon that you see from the folks that you work with that would allow us to start to look at more diverse ways of putting funds together to go after some of this infrastructure.
Yeah, and we've seen some startups try to tackle this. Neighborly was one of them around sort of broadband infrastructure and looking at municipal bonds. They've had a tough challenge in sort of trying to rethink some of these financial models at a city level. I think taking a step back, when you think about sort of the scale and size of government investments that are happening, government spend represents globally 20% of GDP. And I think there's a big opportunity in thinking about how do we allocate more of that funding locally? How do we ensure that that's more viable? And how do we make sure it's more accessible to the points that Lisa and Patrick have been making? A lot of sort of what we've seen is that there's special set-asides or preferences given, but in many ways that's a turnoff to people who need those sort of leg ups. We've heard from startups and companies that they feel like those things are not for them; those are for insiders. And what we've seen is that if government sort of rethinks how they do their business to make things easier, that they'll actually get more people engaging and more people participating. So something as simple as and mundane as digitizing processes, especially with COVID-19, you're going to see a lot more and greater types of diversity participating. And how I think that links to capital is that when this market is more fluid and it's easier to enter the market and there's more opportunities, you're going to see more capitals from investors saying, hey, we want to participate. And right now, I think they see government as just a really difficult market to crack, and working with cities and communities is just a very difficult uphill road, and they don't have the consistency and timelines that they need to get the returns. So I think a big part of it is that our governments need to change how they're thinking about deploying their investments and their capital to be focused more locally, make that more equitable by streamlining that. And I think from there, you'll see just capital naturally flowing. And just as an example, when we've streamlined the procurement process, we've seen over 50% of the founders that are getting contracts are from underrepresented communities, people of color, women founders, LGBTQ. And that's without any set-asides. This is just creating a more level playing field so that the sort of legacy large players don't have that sort of distinct advantage that they do today because of the resources and their understanding of the process and lobbyists, et cetera. So I think there's a bunch of benefits in sort of rethinking the systems here. But it's not, it's not interesting, sexy work, right? An elected official is not going to win votes on this. But I think the smart officials like Governor Newsom, they're gonna drive that from an administrative standpoint. We're seeing that in other cities and states as well.
Thanks, Jay.
Wilf, could I follow up on?
Please follow up. That's great.
And Lisa mentioned this around ensuring access to the investments that are the public-private investments, making sure that underrepresented minority groups, however you want to call folks who don't traditionally have access to the kind of returns that an infrastructure deal might have or what have you, are able to participate. How do you do that? And one of the exciting things we're building for infracenters and hopefully for deployment in the OMSI infracenter is a partnership with a group that's creating what's called a C-REIT, a Community Real Estate Investment Trust. And the idea is to create the opportunity for local community members across the Portland area to invest in this piece of infrastructure that's in their area. So they can invest in something local, so they have a stake in it, but then they can also, those stakeholders can also be part of the, get a return on that investment that's in their community. And so that the principle here is that we need to generally across the United States begin to create mechanisms for capital to continuously circulate and build within our metropolitan scale economies. The current system has been for the last 30 years aggregating that the winnings to major capital centers, whether it's New York or Chicago or San Francisco. But we need to start to create some mechanisms for local, at the metro scale, communities to begin to build, form capital and build the stock of capital in that and the flows of that capital within their community. And so we're excited about the C-REIT idea. I think maybe Wilf, one of the reasons why you're hoping John Haines could join us is in the next piece of that is how do we make sure that low income participants are able to participate as well. And I think that's the exciting thing that John has been working on in Portland.
Yeah, no, I think so, exactly. So maybe this is a good opportunity to introduce John. If you just flick down to the next slide, Ruthie, that would be great. But we are getting close to the end of the first hour here, and I would like to just ask John to introduce himself a little bit and talk a little bit about what he's been doing through Mercy Corps and how that is looking at ways to bring the community into the investments in a rather innovative way. John, are you able to unmute and talk? Ruthie, can you see if John's unmutable? See if I can do it. Well, has John dropped off? He was there for a minute. There he is. Yeah, you're unmuted, John. But I'm not hearing you. Ruthie, is there any way you can check and see why we can't hear John? Let me ask Thomas to step up for a second. He did ask a question. I think it was of you, Patrick, and maybe he can interject that and we can introduce John right after that.
You want me to speak, Wilf?
Yeah, just ask the question. That'd be great. I saw you put it in the chat, but I think it's better if it comes from you.
Oh, yeah. This was an early on question with Patrick talking about the infrastructure project. I was just wondering how the project in Portland is either similar or different from the Alphabet Sidewalk Toronto project, the well-known project that recently got sidelined. Again, how are the projects that we're doing in Portland the same or different than that sidewalk project, either in terms of goals or focus or funding?
Great, thanks, Thomas. And I think for the audience out there, we're not related. So I know a little bit about the Alphabet project in Toronto. Fundamentally, we're starting this from an infrastructure perspective and not from a let's get everybody's data perspective. So that's one part of it, is that we're trying to drive the sustainability goal that OMSI has set out for us through innovative approaches to stacking utility infrastructure. And so our primary focus really has been on that. That said, one of the things we're doing that very intentionally, not because that we were doing it before Google crashed and burned in Toronto, but is to ensure that our district operating system, if you will, is open source. And so that's the incredible gift of urban systems and open commons that Wilf has been leading is to ensure that the systems that allow us to trade energy across what had been previously siloed utilities, so that a battery in a given apartment can be bidirectional, can receive energy and also sell it back to the grid, that those transactions can happen in a way that is effective, but it's not tied to any type of monetization of the data. And at that point, I think I should turn over to Wilf, who's going to be much more eloquent about that than me.
Oh, thanks. No, I think you've got it very, very nicely structured. There's actually there's a growing community of folks who are trying to address that problem. It was known prior to Google committing to work on Toronto, and I think they were quite heavily warned that they were running into a bit of a headwind there. I think it took us a little by surprise quite how bluntly it happened. But you can look at efforts coming out of MIT by Tim Berners-Lee, and actually Andrew Yang has a new program out there towards ownership, not just ownership of data, but how an individual personally can monetize their data instead of having it monetized by a Google or a Facebook or other. It's one thing to have corporations in that level of influence over our data, but totally another one if the government is in that position. And most governments I know, certainly the city of Portland is very sensitive to this and has done a lot of very good work to ensure that that they don't end up collecting large amounts of data that could be used against its population. And I think it does take some real thinking there, and there's both very good progress on the policy front and very good policy advances on the technology front. I don't know, Jay, if you've got any thoughts there around the data side and privacy that you want to interject, but please feel free to do so.
Yeah, I think I think it goes to really the values of the community, and each community is different. But I think here in the U.S., I think we can generally agree that this data does not belong in the hands of private companies and to monetize without some sort of consent process, opt-in process, and so I think the power shift needs to happen here. And I think it's really the onus is on, sort of the civic institutions to safeguard the public's interests. And I think there needs to be some fundamental principles in place. And it's unfortunate that, what happened with Sidewalk Labs, it really, I think, has sort of color the discussion going forward, and everyone's going to point to that and be hesitant to sort of look at sort of this digital operating system for cities. Obviously there's a bunch of upside, but there's some big and legitimate concerns that folks have in our communities. And I think what we saw also in Toronto is that there wasn't the infrastructure around civic engagement to really have these conversations. A lot of it was put together sort of as it was happening. So what are those governance structures that need to be created in advance for this to happen in the right way? I think just, open source is not always the right answer, or even privacy centric, as we're seeing with Apple and Google on their sort of COVID-19 work. There needs to be the right level of balance, and that changes based on values and the circumstances. When you have a public health crisis, there may be needs to be more flexible when it comes to privacy. I don't think everyone would agree with that, but I think it's not going to be sort of a binary sort of discussion, but it's an important discussion. So
it is.
For flagging that.
Probably spend the whole time on it, but I think yes. I'll take another whack at seeing if we can get John on. It would be great, John, if you could introduce yourself and some of the work that you're doing.
Yeah, I'm sorry, you were trying to get me earlier.
No, that's fine.
I apologize. I'm in Portland. I see there's a number of people in Portland. We've created a model called the Community Investment Trust that we've piloted in Portland. It's a wealth building initiative for people in a neighborhood. We're targeting low-income investors, first-time investors, people of color, renters. And our pilot property on 122nd, if people in Portland, is in the lowest income census tract in the state. Very diverse area. It's a landing pad for refugees, immigrants, people displaced elsewhere in the city, where urban renewal and other efforts have taken place over the last 50 years. So we piloted a product and an approach. The 5 key elements to it are that it's accessible for people at a low dollar amount, monthly investments, $10 to $100. It's in commercial real estate. It's offered only to 4 zip codes, so the proximity matters. For the commercial retail tenants, they get more traffic as a result of it, and more activity at the building. It's a roughly 29,000 square foot building and on 1.43 acres. We bought it for 1.2 million at the end of 2014. It's worth 2 million now. There's an aggregated net worth in the building that's part of a corporation that the community owns. 160 something families at this point. We have room to double that. They come on every month after taking a course called Moving from Owning to Owning. We've had a net increase in investors, only 2 decreased during COVID. And we've had an increase from doing Zoom classes of about 20 extra families. So resilient there, and surprising that we didn't lose a lot of investors. But of course, we designed this for people to cash out when met their goals or when they needed emergency money. The other key aspect of the model is that it's downside risk protected. So investors can get their money out anytime they want. So full liquidity. We did that through a direct pay letter of credit on our primary lender, the bank, with the mortgage. And people get an annual dividend based upon the performance of the property. That's averaging 9.3% for 3 rounds of dividends. Share prices increased in the 26 months we're at 36 months now, but at the end of the fiscal year, 12/31, we repriced the shares based on the value of the property and the pay down of debt. Share price has gone from $10 to $15.87. I just got off the phone with Omaha yesterday. I was on the phone with Lubbock, Texas, and Cleveland. Day before that, Phoenix. So the interest in this model has exploded. And we're working at various stages of replication with about 60 cities in 24 states. And, taking the Portland model to the nation.
That's impressive. I mean, several questions. So it's gone a long way since I first started talking to you about it, John. That's very impressive. So let me ask a question, because I wasn't quite sure. You touched on it, but I wasn't quite sure. So your investors are using some of that equity that they have established to help them through this crunch time. Is that the case, that there are actually withdrawals going on at the moment?
No, that was surprising to us, but and we prepared for that, because that's basically why we made this investment, is for people who have an emergency fund. That was one of their motivations for investing. The majority of investors are first-time investors and renters and people of color, refugees. So we thought, yeah, there's going to be a run on it, and it's kind of too bad on one hand, but it's exactly what we created it for. Well, we paused the investment for 2 months, for March for April and May. So we didn't draw on anybody's accounts, but people could opt in, and we had about 25% opt in. At the same time, we only had two families or 2 investors divest because they needed the money, and we've added a net positive between 15 and 20 new investors during COVID. And we're asking people why now, and they had time to take the class. They're still motivated to invest. And they were actually saving money. If one family member was working, they're actually saving money by not spending. So they're investing at lower dollar amounts, but they are, there's still demand, even in a time of, relative crisis, even in Portland.
That's fascinating. At what level? I know the way you started this was Mercy Corps made the initial investment, and then you're sort of selling out. So there's a proportion that you have managed to get community members to acquire. Is that getting to be a significant proportion of the initial investment?
Yeah, we, Mercy Corps put in subordinated, unsecured patient capital, as did two impact investors. We ended up putting in 220,000. The impacted investors put in 230,000 under the same terms. Because we didn't know how long or how fast the investors would come on. Of course, they come in every month. We pay down the debt on the impact on our impact investors first, because it's 4%. Our money's at 2%, and we've paid off over out of the 230. I think we're close to 200,000 in the churn every month of investors coming in. The average investment is again, it goes from 10 to 100, but the average is around $80. So we're making a dent in reducing that subordinated impact investor debt. You know, that helps the bottom line because we're not paying 4% interest to the impact investors.
That's great.
So, you know, it's key, well, just to mention, this isn't a capital raising tool. This is an equity shift after, you know, Patrick, you put some good points out about de-risking, standardization, size, and some performance metrics. So with a pilot project like this, we really needed those to be able to validate it for external other cities that do this. So those are sort of the same principles we went through to make the investment viable. Now we did it because we bought it in end of 2014, didn't put it into public ownership until November of 17. During that period of time, we could do the deferred maintenance, get it leased up and built the value. So we could get the letter of credit on top of the primary mortgage under a 75% loan to value and a debt service coverage ratio of 1.25. That's going to get a little bit more stressful as that letter of credit escalates because it has to cover the full value of the share value. So people don't lose their money and they have full liquidity to their, not only their investment amount, but the gain. And we had to do that for legal reasons to get the securities exemption to do this. And we're the only people in the country that have come up with this through help from our attorneys in Portland. They're municipal bond attorneys largely in Oregon, but they're a big public finance law firm, or Carrington Sutcliffe. And they found this mechanism. You can either get a city guarantee to get this exemption or a direct pay letter of credit. And the city of Portland couldn't with their financial circumstances do it. And, you know, that's a risk anyway, because you need the longevity of the guarantee as a contingent liability for the city for the length of the investment. So the direct pay letter of credit ended up being the better route for protection for the investors. Does that help?
It helps a lot.
Okay.
No, I think it's a fascinating model and certainly a really interesting way to bring the community in. You know, one of the questions we've been talking about, and I think you go a good way to addressing it, is this issue of gentrification, right? That unfortunately a lot of these communities get, you know, as they add value, as people move in, as the minority communities move in, they add value and they bring vibrancy to these communities. But unfortunately, none of that good work accrues back to them. It accrues back to the landowners, and having that kind of ownership by the participants in the community, even if then they get gentrified, in effect, you know, they get at least some benefit out of that gentrification. But of course, if they own enough in the investment, then that allows them to hang on to their investments longer, right? It's not always that the value of the land dominates in decision making, but the community has more voice. Have you seen more of that? I know you have those members of the community participating in decisions around what will be done with the investment. Is that still very active? Are you still getting a lot of participation?
Yes. You know, I'm really happy to see that it's authentically driven by our investors and community groups that we work with. You know, we're known in Portland. Mercy Corps is known and trusted, and some of our investors have worked with Mercy Corps in places of conflict where they've come from, which is an interesting juxtaposition. But, you know, the building starts to advertise itself because we have a lot of public events, art events, placemaking events, and greenscaping, and welcome a homeless shelter next door. These are all driven by our investors. And so the activity itself helps the tenants, helps engage the community. But when somebody becomes an investor, and we're doing the class in 6 different languages, once an investor comes on board, they become really our stealth marketing, and they draw the trust of the community members to that person. You know, very often a refugee or an immigrant from, say, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, former NS, Soviet states, etc. You know, a lot of the, particularly the people that are, you know, basically over age 30 or 40, they don't trust banks. They've never had a bank account. They don't trust the government, from where they came, largely driven by that. They haven't used a computer, and they have no sense of the language and there aren't even words translated for some of the things we're teaching. So we get really good community members to do that education, and very often it's their kids that kind of help them sign up online under our investment portal. So kids pull the parents along, and the twist that we're seeing in Colorado Springs that's really going to be interesting and fascinating is the Health Foundation there and other community foundations have worked with the school district, and they want to have the investment that they choose to target middle and high school kids. Obviously, their parents at age 18 need to sign them up, but there's some philanthropic money to match what they would put in, and some service learning projects for them to make money. And then when they graduate, they leave with not only the class understanding, but they're already an investor and an understanding of some of the systems of finance, and they leave with to go to college or trade school or buy a car, whatever their goal is when they graduate. And the replication of this model, you know, has really interesting variations from St. Louis to Kansas City to Omaha. We're seeing in Phoenix who they're targeting, how big the geography is of zip codes they're using, mixed use, different kind of commercial retail space, incubator space, et cetera. And I think that's going to be the value is when we do our first 10, we've got a community of practice that is going to make the next 100, you know, with case studies and models for deviation from our sole, you know, primary pilot example.
I don't know if we've still got Lisa on the line. I know, Lisa, you might have had to leave, but are there any? Is there anything here that you would want to, who originally brought up, you know, the need to make sure that we address equity? Are you working directly with John and Mercy Corps on this?
I think John could answer that question. As there has been, I would say, long-standing exchange and discussions between Prosper and Mercy Corps. I do think I would just both acknowledge the work, acknowledge that I think as we think about this, particularly in the context of infrastructure, I think John has a lot of good advice, both to our community partners and lessons learned as to kind of how scalable is it, how does this work? So we have talked and had John and/or Mercy Corps partners come out to projects, including ones that are kind of land-based projects with the Black community where there was displacement that occurred due to urban renewal. I think there's, you know, I would say this is one example amongst many. And so I think it's a really important project. And I think there continues to be longstanding interest also in who owns the property, not just kind of an investment opportunity, but fundamentally kind of how do land trusts work, who owns the property, how do we show up on scale? So when you have something the size of kind of an OMSI opportunity that is $1 billion to multi-billions of dollars relative to smaller scale, how does a mechanism like this scale, or at least kind of the ethos of that scale? And I think that is all healthy and alive as conversations within Portland. And I don't know that we have a good model to point to. So we're running a parallel conversation to OMSIs around a 15 to 30 acre site, depending on how you could consider it. We purchased a large post office site in downtown Portland as Prosper Portland and have put it out. And so there is a incredibly healthy community benefits negotiation that is happening on that property that takes into consideration not only kind of investment opportunities, but also affordable commercial space opportunities for small businesses. So I would say there's a lot of shared practices or shared desired outcomes that are happening between the Mercy Corps project and Prosper Portland's work. And one of the challenges is really defining not only how does it scale across communities within the US, but what are elements that may be added to it, like land ownership, and also with particular communities, And how does it scale volume wise when you get into kind of very large scale urban setting developments like OMSI?
Yeah, you know, we were written into the proposal that I met with Sarah Architects like 3 years ago. So I know we were in the proposal, but I haven't talked with anybody subsequently to that. One thing we're doing, I'll mention this, you know, swiftly. We initiated some research really to help ourselves and to help others that were reaching out to us about wealth building initiatives relative to real estate specifically, not data and other ones that are great, but just not our real estate focus. So I had an intern from Reed College, an economics student, last year put together a matrix with the range of initiatives on the top and then the attributes or characteristics on the left-hand side, from governance, the size of investment, geography, et cetera, return. And we've widened it this summer to work with several organizations, Accelerate for America, Kresge, Brookings, Urban Institute, Aspen Institute, a couple others, to coordinate what efforts they're seeing around the country. And the matrix is exploded to about 30. And we're looking at US, Canada, because Canada has some interesting shared equity models for, you know, for home ownership in Toronto and other places. And also there's a very interesting model or two in Australia. So we're going to put that together in collaboration with all these groups and share it by the end of the summer, beginning of fall. And then it's out there. We can collectively add to it. But right now it's kind of a wild, wild west of new initiatives coming on board and some confusion between attributes of community land trust and shared equity models in general, privately held, you know, corporate or nonprofit led. Ours, you know, is guided by a nonprofit. We started it, but it's entirely owned by the community. It's an Oregon C corporation that the community owns 100% of.
Well, that's very, very, very interesting. Let me pull in Limor and Ian. I'd asked them to join us. As I say, between the three of us, we're parts of, we're working on different aspects of a sort of national blueprint supported by NIST and the Department of Commerce. And I think we're all very interested in how public-private partnerships play a role. And I would like to think that at the end of this discussion, which I think has been, so far has been really excellent, and what I'm hoping to do with sort of the last 30 minutes or so here is to start to think about where we go from here, how we take what we're talking about here and roll it into some of these concepts, particularly as we start to look at, you know, at sort of the new normal, as we'd said. I don't know, Limor, if you have anything, or Ian, you have anything you want to chime in with here from your experience working, you know, on utilities, the horizontal infrastructure or the vertical infrastructure.
Ian, you want to go first?
Sure, I'll go first. Thank you. I'm starting my video. There we are. So the GCT utility supercluster focuses on sustainability challenges related to energy, water, waste management. And basically, we are, I think, the world's largest public-private partnership. We bring cities, counties, and municipalities together with technology solution providers, academia, entrepreneurs, nonprofits, and associations to share real-world class examples and best practices and serve as a practical guide for the implementation of smart city strategies. So we are a collaboration organization working to serve the communities, not just here in the States, but worldwide for smart city strategies and solutions.
Limor, you want to chip in a little bit too? Maybe, I know you've just completed, or you're in the process of wrapping up a sort of blueprint around smart buildings, and I don't know. I seem to remember there is a section that talks about how to go about raising funds to build that smart infrastructure. Are there any things that you've heard or you want to sort of pick up on here?
Yeah, well, I thought I would actually take a slightly different angle because the panelists have spoken so eloquently on fundraising. I'll add a point, but I think also I want to put some structure at least around how we're thinking about smart buildings and the smart context, and that might lead to some conversation. Because when we're thinking about the smart building, because it's all digitized, we see real property as becoming almost like a piece of software, and it's data-rich software, so that goes to some of the data elements and conversations that were just happening, but also a piece of software. So that means it's completely manipulable, it's agile, it can be flexible, it can be a lot of things, and it's the context within which we live as human beings. So I'm offering these thoughts because it's, yes, it's about the technology, but you know what, it's really not about the technology, but it's about all of us and ensure that the citizenry feels comfortable and safe, and that they can get access to what they need and the services they need, that it's equitable, et cetera, et cetera. And so as we're thinking about these funding of the projects, I think it's also important for us to have a strategic overall global view of how we think of that built environment, how we integrate the built environment from a city infrastructure perspective, as well as an individual property perspective. So for example, one of the things that we write about in the blueprint that we're going to issue hopefully within another month or so is that the mesh infrastructure, the smart buildings actually create a mesh infrastructure for the municipality as a whole, then as a result also up into the buildings. Now, what does that mean? What that enables, for example, let's say communications infrastructure. We've seen the dearth of communications infrastructure that exists, how it is impacting us across all communities, and most particularly those that are suffering from the digital divide. From an education perspective, both from K through 12, as well as higher ed, but also upskilling the working populace so they can get that next new job. And we're seeing significant gaps there. So having that proper communications infrastructure ubiquitous across the board for everyone equally at high speeds and high density, et cetera, I think is something then, you know, the building infrastructure, it's almost like street furniture. It serves a role. It has a place to play. So then the question is, if we think of our cities in this way, our buildings and the real property, which is both publicly owned but also privately owned. So already we've got this public-private partnership, even if it's not with dollars. There's a role that the private property owners can play in this. How do we build a global view of what this new kind of urban environment, or not urban, town, municipality, rural environment that we want to live in? How do we build that new vision? And then how do we make use of property in order to enable that vision? And then now, how do we fund it, both from a property perspective, and sometimes from a property perspective, it can be not just actual dollars that go into it, but like the almost in-kind contribution of private properties to be part of the municipal infrastructure. At least those are some of the ideas that I'm playing with, that we're playing with at the organization. So at the Global City Teams Challenge Smart Building Supercluster. So I welcome getting feedback from the group, because maybe I'm just dreaming, but I believe that we have a role to play as the framework within which we live in the built environment, and that public and private can have really interesting roles to play in addition to what you've been sharing.
Oh, I love that direction. And I think it plays on a whole bunch of things. I don't know, John, if you want to add anything there. I know, as we said earlier, your community gets to sort of program the buildings, but I think, you know, that's happening sort of over a longer period of time. And what Limor is sort of offering is this ability to think about a more flexible space, a more shared space. How do you see that? I mean, do you see that as an opportunity to be able to use space more effectively for the community, or do you see problems with that path?
No, that's exactly the right path. I think the flexibility in the property can be a capitalization question. So just for instance, a couple of cities are really interested in putting in accelerator affordable space for startup businesses. Now, they're ones that our property management firm is never going to lease to. But if there were some sort of a backstop or support, or buy down of their lease costs, maybe that's in the initial capitalization of the building, so you can do half of it with a lower yield, but then a lower debt cost, and then you can widen the function of the building. We're able to do that to a certain extent, certainly through just small spaces that we veto our property manager on, saying, this is the kind of business or nonprofit. Eritrean Ethiopian startup nonprofit doesn't even have their 501c3, and they just needed a couple hundred square feet to get started. And we make the decision for the benefit of the operating bylaws of our board of directors. Does we act as advisors to the board to allow that diversity and range that's really the character of the building.
No, that's great. Jay, do you want to chip in here at all on some of the ways in which technology could help with this kind of sharing?
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute there. I think, the technology piece really is going to require folks to really deeply think about what those outcomes that they're looking to achieve. As you know, technology can take a lot of different forms and structures. And that's, I think, some of the challenges we've seen is that historically folks have really focused on very prescriptive requirements about specific technologies. And we know that technology is changing rapidly, and I wouldn't even know how you describe artificial intelligence and machine learning. So really thinking about the values and the outcomes that you're wanting in sort of these technology solutions is going to be important. That's sort of what I want to add.
No, that's great.
Yeah, and if
No,
I
I think this helps us, right? I mean, I think it's as useful. Did you have more questions you wanted to sort of pose?
No, I just wanted to offer a comment, if I may. I think Jay is right. I think one of the things, and I'll say that I'm one of the people that falls into this trap. When I think about the technology, I get very excited about the technology, and I forget we're trying to serve human beings. But I think one of the things that's really important to keep in mind across the board is that we need to have, and I say this because I see this happening so often in cities and different smart city objectives, and that is that they actually have a very narrow objective because they're concerned with their budgets, with their election cycle, et cetera, all of which are very important, but cannot, when we're dealing with the built environment, we're not dealing with just tomorrow or 2 years from now. We're dealing with 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now. And when we're building a property now, we're building it for another 50 years at least. So we need to also have that mentality in place. And it's really tough because, and I welcome all your thoughts on this. One, we don't know what society is going to be like in 50 years. So how do we address that? To your point, Jay, how do we make it so that the environment is going to support the people the way they need to be supported at that time and over the course of time from when the building actually opens, let's say in 5 years, to another 50 years after that? And then how do you adapt for those technologies? How do you leave room for the technology advances that are going to take place, that are going to serve the people at that point in time and over the course of time, et cetera, et cetera? I think we're dealing with these fascinating puzzles. And we're in a very rich time to actually deal with this, both in terms of what we're seeing is coming forward from a social perspective. So we're seeing a lot that needs to be taken care of, which is great. Not that it has to be taken care of and it wasn't taken care of, but the fact that we're seeing it and let's pay attention and let's do something about it. And now we have the tools to do something. So now what is that going to be? And again, what is that going to be for now? And what is that going to be for the future? So I'm curious to hear from everyone what you see. How are you framing things in terms of your thinking and again, not just for now, but as the process of the future starts unfolding, and how do we plan now for that future?
So I encourage people just to come off mute and ask questions at this point. We're a small enough group that I think we can handle it. But I will set it up, and I'll ask you the question, Patrick, because I know we've been working on this a lot in the OMSI district, right? That you can sort of think of the building as having 3 different timescales all operating together, right? So as you point out, Limor, there's the 50, 100-year time frame of the fixed infrastructure. and then there's a sort of 10-year rotation of use of various parts of the building. And then as we bring technology in, there's a sort of 2 to 3 year cycle on things like, you know, smart light switches and screens and networks and other things. And it's actually quite difficult to put those together in a logical way. When you're designing the building, you want to think about it in that kind of modular sense to make sure, and we got this particularly in spades at the Armsy district because one of the purposes of Armsy, which is a museum of science and industry, is to show smart city technology. And clearly we don't want to burden it with, you know, 2020 technology that in 5 years time is just old, because it doesn't really meet. Patrick, I don't know if you want to chip in on this and sort of lead a bit of a discussion here.
Yeah, I think, thanks, Wilf. I think, yeah, it's a critical challenge because I think you can, you know, even Thomas Jefferson, you know, didn't want, you know, future societies to be settled by, you know, what worked for their grandparents. And so same thing just on technology and use, and it applies in this case. And I think modularity is definitely that technology, you know, a key principle that can help with the technology side. That midterm thing around use. Right now, we have a zoning, the broad zoning kind of approach across the United States is use-based zoning, right? So this can be residential, this can be office, or etc. There's a new, relatively new movement in the last decade, it's really taken off, called form-based code instead of use-based code. And to the extent that, and form-based code basically says, this is the character of this neighborhood. It's a mid-rise, transit-oriented community. And so it's the form of the place that gets set in law, but the use is allowed to evolve over time. And then if you've got that modularity built into the buildings, then you can evolve more in a more agile fashion, I guess, to throw that word back out. And I think those two concepts together are really powerful to allow the innovation to keep pace with the implementation of innovations to keep pace with the technology, and to not to allow us to reuse places. Right now, since World War II, we've basically been in a mode across the United States where if it's a single-use place, if it's just a bedroom community, and there's a new type of bedroom community, we throw that out, right? And the value goes down, and we waste our places. We waste real estate in that sense. And so I think as we move forward, we're going to have to shift away from use-based codes to form-based codes so that we can continually adapt these incredible places. And then you think about the investments that John's making in that building, then the value, the return on investment that that his shareholders are getting is going to improve, because we're not going to throw out the place where that building lives, right? It's only going to increase in value, and the participants in those schemes can continue to enjoy the returns from their early investments.
Other comments on this, or questions, or input for Limor?
Well, General
Benny Lee.
Benny, fire away.
Yeah, you know, thank you for, you know, this summit, right? And, you know, I think we covered a lot of different points. I remember last year when we attended the Portland summit, and one of the things is, you know, I brought up a number of matters, particularly when we had the Women in Tech panel. You know, there was, I believe, 3 guys and 3 women on the panel. We had, Limor was on the panel. It was a wonderful discussion, but it also speaks to the equity issue. And I think some of the challenges that we have today, and particularly with, you know, particularly the riots, the civil unrest, it really speaks to an issue that has to be addressed, you know, by addressing it with the communities of color and also those who are disconnected. You know, one of the presentations I did recently, I talked about a couple of weeks ago, we heard about the fact that 45 million people are unemployed. That's a number that is very hard for us to wrap around because that's greater than the population of many countries and greater than the population of the state of California. Having stated that, one of the other metrics that I got from that was, I heard that 13.5 million people were unable to get their unemployment. That's a scary thought because now when we throw that number into the mix, in other words, we're telling certain families who are trying to pay their rent, trying to put food on the table, trying to pay their basic electricity bill, that you're going to have to wait. We don't have any services. We don't have any connections for you to really solve that problem. And so these folks who have no predictability, and I'll put it this way, many of them were largely in communities of color. That became an issue where civil unrest would definitely happen. And I think, and I know that Michael Dunaway is on here because he handles the GCTC public safety supercluster. You know, I looked at numbers, right? And, you know, the NIH had a study. The study was commissioned in 2011 to 2014 and basically looking at officer-involved shootings that basically measured actually communities of colors in terms of how much they were killed. So I was in some discussions, and some of the discussions came to me where the discussion says, you know, there are more officer-involved shootings of people who were white, and there was a greater number killed than blacks. But we changed that number down to the ratio of the population. We find that the ratio is actually significantly worse for you know, people of African American descent. In fact, that number was 4-to-1. And when we go to certain southern counties, that number is 20-to-1, where if you're a person who is of African American descent, there's a 20-to-1 chance that you're going to be killed in an officer-involved shooting and you're unarmed. So technology definitely plays a role. You know, that study that was done by NIH was very eye-opening. I think part of the systems that we have to really focus on is capturing those metrics, capturing the equity metrics, and putting that as a scoreboard for councils to decide. It's one of the things I do as a council member for the city of San Leandro. I've asked for those metrics. For the longest time, I got resistance. And now, because of the civil unrest, they're considering to put those in place. And I think as tech leaders, smart communities, we have to provide those measurements because technology has the ability to capture those metrics, because that is a scorecard that we can actually hold public officials accountable for changing those metrics. And that includes economic resilience with respect to those communities that are in the underserved or unserved communities. So I wanted to make that comment, you know, because I think there was a lot of smart discussions in here. I think what's missing from here was, you know, seeing some more communities of color part in this mix. And maybe they're not in this mix because they have not had the opportunities to participate, or they have not been invited to be included in this mix. That was a mouthful.
No, it's fine. There certainly were some of the communities of color, and I know Thomas particularly, with his focus on human factors, has been working pretty actively with some of the communities of color and others in Portland. Of course, John and Lisa do as well. Michael, did you want to chip in there at all?
Just a comment. Can you hear me okay, Wilf?
Yep, absolutely.
Good deal. Benny, thanks for the plug. I wasn't expecting that. So I gave a briefing yesterday. Actually, Dean Skidmore, Brenda Bannon, and I briefed a group that Dean is involved in, calls and I'll probably get this acronym wrong, he calls it NIPSTIC, but it's the National Public Safety Telecommunications Consortium or something like that. And the three of us gave a presentation basically on our public safety work in PSSC, a public safety supercluster. And we're in the process. So my contribution to that was sort of a description of a program that, well, a project, I guess, that we're about to launch in the public safety supercluster, which is sort of a part of an outgrowth of conversations I've had with Thomas Doherty, Wilf, about the fact that we really need to redefine public safety in a much broader and more inclusive perspective. And we're seeing this take place all over the country right now. And I don't need to belabor that issue, but you all are watching it unfold just as I am. And the sense of what constitutes a safe and resilient community, I think, is going to undergo some really significant, I'll call it change. It's more like reevaluation. And quite frankly, it's going to be a lot more like soul searching and trying to redefine what we really mean by a safe and resilient community. The real point, however, is that what we're doing in the PSSC is and I've had preliminary conversations with Saku about this, we're planning on a late fall, probably early spring next year, which is to say, February, March, I would imagine, a workshop similar to the one we did 2 years ago, 2018, that examines, in this case, not cybersecurity and its relationship to public safety, but public health and its relationship to public safety. And what we're hoping to do is sort of lead. So you all probably are aware, FEMA has for a long time, for several years now, adopted the mantra that what they want to establish is a whole of community approach to public safety. And they've done fairly well at publicizing that. Well, it turns out that the CDC has a very similar program called the Whole Community Approach to Public Health. But as you and I recognize, as we all recognize, I mean, at this stage, whole community in the public health sector means wear face masks, don't shake hands, keep social distancing, and try to minimize your interaction on a social level in groups more than 10. I mean, that's the public health department's engagement with the civil community right now amounts to that. So there's a lot of work to be done in how we define all of this. And I think Benny has really touched on a major issue. And that is we need to look at at the issue of inclusivity and acknowledgement of all of the social dimensions of our communities. Frankly, speaking as a former naval officer, we need to look at it as a national security issue because we're seeing the implications to national security play out before our very eyes right now. And I think reevaluating all of that on a very broad scale is going to be the task of the next several years for the GCTC. Because particularly when we start looking at public health, I mean, Wilf, your teams have really focused on public transportation. And public transportation right now is undergoing a serious reevaluation in terms of its health implications. So, I mean, that's just one piece of it. Limor, your work in smart buildings touches on the same issue. I think all of us are going to be very much engaged in this in the future. And I would offer that, frankly, we ought to make that part of GCTC's mission in the very near term to sort of take up these issues. And in the PSSC, that's certainly what we're going to do. So sorry for holding forth. I appreciate the invitation and Benny, the comment, but I think that's frankly where we're going. And our group, the GCTC in general, but each of our superclusters is in a real position to lead a lot of that. And I think we should capitalize on our own capabilities to do so.
Yeah, no, and really thanks for doing that. I think that's true. And it's sort of heading where I want to sort of wrap this up, which is, I don't want this to be the end of this, right? This is, I think all these issues, and I think you're starting to point really to a crunch piece of this, which is things are changing rapidly. And as we settle on the new normal, or as we, recognize, the sort of going back to the beginning of this, we go back to the idea that as we try to get back to at least having the population be able to engage economically, whether it's the same way or in different ways, and whether it's after the end of this virus or, we have to figure out how to do that while it's still going on because there's no particular end in sight at the moment. that we will need to make significant investments, and we ought to be making them in ways that move us towards these kind of resilient communities, that move us towards being able not just to cope with COVID, not just to cope with the social equity issues that have come up from George Floyd's murder, but the direction that we need to be going in to deal with issues of climate change and others, and building those communities. And I think it does need to be addressing issues of inclusion, who's investing, how are they investing, who benefits from the economic improvements that we get when communities become vibrant and effective, but then also who takes the hit when the next catastrophe comes through, and how do we make sure that as we go through these peaks and troughs, that we're building communities that are designed to deal with them, that are designed to not only help us be highly productive and effective during the times of growth and stability, but don't lose all of those gains when we get tripped up by a COVID or some other pandemic of sorts, if we want to put it that way. I think you framed that really nicely. And Michael mentioned, and I think several of us have now mentioned the GCTC. It is an open community, right? We've been working at this for 4 or 5 years and have sort of broken it into areas of study and are writing documents in support of the objectives laid out by the National Institute of Standards and Technology and the US Department of Commerce. And we're continually looking for volunteers to help and people to contribute to this effort. So please don't feel like you're on the outside of that, where if you're not already a member, we would love you to join us. Are there other questions and points to raise here that people have? I think I have most people's contact, and I hope I will certainly go back to Ruthie. I don't know if Ruthie, if you're online right now, but I think I would like to make sure that we do continue. So please feel free to send me email if you're interested in a continuing effort to sort of build on this. I think time is critical. I like Michael's suggestion that we use the GCTC. And I think, as GCTC leaders, we ought to collectively look for how this direction that we've been talking about impacts every one of the aspects of the smart cities we're looking at: utilities, buildings, resiliency, telecommunications, transportation, and sort of build them in. And maybe we can use our existing organizational structure to do this. I think we need to do it quickly. I think there will be continued efforts to stimulate the economy, and to the extent that some of those are able to be used to revamp infrastructure, we ought to be revamping it for the future and not for the past. We shouldn't be building new roads and new buildings in the old way. We should be building new transportation systems and new habitation and office spaces that meet our needs for the future. Anybody else want to sort of make any closing remarks here?
Yeah, that was great. Will, thank you so much. This has been fascinating.
Yeah, well, thank you for pulling this all together,
great.
and everybody, Limor and Ian, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Ruthie, do you want to close it up? Do you have anything you want to drop in the last comments?
Nothing to add, really. Just thanks to everyone for joining and for the very interesting conversation.
Yeah, thanks everybody. This was really excellent. Much appreciated. And I hope to be talking to you more as we move into the next phase of trying to figure out how to document some of this and set a path for the future. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you again for this.
Cheers.
Thanks again.
Thanks, Patrick. Thanks everyone. Much appreciate your input.